Hi, this is Becky Spain, your instructor for business communication. Today we will be reviewing Chapter 10 of Excellence in Business Communication. This chapter is entitled Writing Persuasive Messages. This chapter completes the section on brief message types. When we look at persuasive messages, we'll be dividing that into two different categories. We'll be looking at persuasive business messages and then marketing and sales messages. Key points for both categories include learning how to frame an argument, balancing emotional and logical appeals, reinforcing your position, anticipating objectives that you're going to get, and then avoiding common mistakes in persuasive communication. I actually think persuasive communication, writing persuasive messages is a lot of fun, so I hope that you enjoy this chapter as much as I have. We'll begin by looking at learning objective number 1, which is applying the 3-step writing process to persuasive messages. So we're going to begin by planning our persuasive message, then by writing the message, and then finally completing the persuasive message. Whether you're convincing your boss to open a new office in Europe or encouraging potential customers to try your product, you'll use many of the same techniques of persuasion, which is the attempt to change an audience's attitude, beliefs, and their actions. Persuasion is not about tricking somebody into doing something or getting people to act against their own best interest. Rather, it's about letting audiences know that they have choices and presenting your offering in the best possible light. So let's begin by looking at step 1, planning our persuasive message. Having a really great idea or a great idea for a product is really no longer enough in today's business environment. Every day, tons of people come up with really great ideas, and yet they go unnoticed, and their good ideas on products go unsold simply because the messages meant to promote them aren't compelling enough to be heard above all the competitive noise. So creating successful persuasive messages demand careful attention to all 4 tasks in the planning step, which is starting with an insightful analysis of your purpose and of your audience. So first, let's look at the first task, which is analyzing the situation. A clear purpose is important in every message that you write, but it's even more important in a persuasive message because you're asking the audience to do something. So in defining your purpose, make sure you're clear about what you really hope to achieve. The best persuasive messages are closely connected to your audience's desires and interests. To understand and categorize your audience's needs, you can refer to specific information such as demographics, which include things like age, gender, occupation, income, education, and then also psychographics, which include your personalities, attitudes, lifestyles. If you aim to change someone's attitudes, beliefs, or actions, you must first understand his or her motivation. A motivation is the combination of forces that drive people to satisfy their needs. The more closely a persuasive message aligns with the recipient's existing motivation, the more effective the message is going to be. So after you've analyzed the situation, the second task is to gather information. We're going to look more closely at the types of information to include in a persuasive business message, and then also in marketing and sales messages later in this chapter. And then chapter 11 presents advice on how to find the information that you need. So we will come back to this here in a few minutes. The third task is to select the right combination of medium and channel. These decisions are particularly critical with persuasive messages because these kinds of messages are often unexpected and sometimes even unwelcome. So, for example, some people don't mind getting promotional email messages for products that they're interested in, but others resent every piece of commercial email that they receive. Different members of the same audience might prefer different medium or channels for the same message. So if you can't be sure that you're going to reach all or most of your audience through a single channel, then try a channel combo using 2 or more. Overlook that social media can provide some exciting options for persuasive messages, particularly for the marketing and sales messages that we'll discuss later. The fourth task is organizing your information. So the nature of persuasion is to convince your audience to change their attitudes, their beliefs, or their actions. So the most persuasive messages use an indirect approach. In contrast, when you have a close relationship with your audience and the message is welcome or neutral, a direct approach can be effective. So your choice between the direct and indirect approach is often influenced by the extent of your authority and expertise. Think carefully about your corporate culture and what your audience expects before selecting your approach. Now that the planning is done, we can move on to step 2, which is writing your persuasive message. Oftentimes with the persuasive message, your message is generally uninvited and occasionally even unwelcome. You really need to focus on the you attitude. It's even more critical in these messages. Most people won't even pay attention to your message, much less respond to it, if it isn't about them. So you can encourage a more welcome reception by doing some of the following things. First of all, make sure that you use polite and positive language. Positive language usually happens naturally with persuasive messages because you're promoting an idea or a product that you believe in. You need to understand and respect cultural differences. Remember when earlier in the book we talked about low context cultures and high context cultures? A message that seems forthright and direct in a low context culture might seem intrusive and brash in a high context culture. You also need to be sensitive to your own organizational culture. And then finally, take steps to establish your credibility. You can boost your credibility by using simple language and providing evidence, identifying sources that you've used, find common ground with your audience, be fair and logical, and show that you have your audience's best interest at heart. After you've planned and you've written your message, then of course the third step is to complete your persuasive message. So professionals know that details can make or break a persuasive message, so they don't skip on this part of the writing process. When you evaluate your content, judge your argument objectively and don't overestimate your credibility. If possible, ask an experienced colleague who knows your audience well to review the draft. And as you produce your message, make sure your design elements complement your argument. Of course, proofread meticulously for any spelling errors, and then finally, make sure your distribution method fits your audience expectations as well as your own purpose. Learning objective number 2, develop persuasive business messages. Describe an effective strategy for developing persuasive business messages and identify the 3 most common strategies. So your success as a business person is closely tied to your ability to encourage others to accept new ideas or change old habits or even act on your recommendations. So unless your career takes you into marketing and sales, most of your persuasive messages will be designed to elicit a preferred response in a non-sales situation. So within the context of the 3-step process, effective persuasion involves 4 essential strategies. Those strategies are framing your argument, balancing emotional and logical appeals, reinforcing your position, and then anticipating objectives. So let's begin by looking at the first essential strategy, which is framing your arguments. Many of the persuasive messages that you're going to find yourself writing follow some variation of the indirect approach. So one of the most commonly used variations is called the AIDA model, and it helps you to organize and present your information in 4 phases: attention, interest, desire, and action. There's a really great figure in your book on page 293 that helps walk through this model for persuasive messages. Make sure that you take a minute or 2 and review that. It will help you to grasp this model. Basically, you're just walking through these 4 steps, and you're beginning with attention. So your first objective is to encourage your audience to want to hear about your problem or your idea or your new product, whatever your main idea is. So be sure to find some common ground on which you can build your case. And then the next step is to look at interest. How can you build interest from your audience? You can do that by providing additional details that prompt your audience members to imagine how the solution might best benefit them. And then third, desire. You want to help your audience embrace your idea by explaining how the change will benefit them and then answering any potential objectives that might arrive. And then finally, you're going to take action. You're going to suggest that the specific action you want your audience to take. So include a deadline when applicable. Working your presentation through these 4 phases will help you to be persuasive in the argument that you're presenting. The AIDA model is tailor-made for using the indirect approach and allowing you to save your main idea for the action phase. However, it can also be modified for the direct approach, but whether you use it for indirect or for direct, the AIDA model does have limitations. For example, you're talking at your audience rather than with them, and you're focusing on a single event rather than on long-term relationships. So as you'll learn in this chapter, a more conversational approach is better with today's social media. So the second essential strategy deals with balancing emotional and logical appeals. So most persuasive messages include both emotional and logical appeals. The key is finding the right balance for each message. So an emotional appeal calls on the human feelings. You're basing your argument on your audience needs and on their sympathies. For instance, you can make use of the emotion inspired by words such as freedom, success, prestige, compassion, and comfort. Such words put your audience in a certain frame of mind and help people accept your message. Many marketing and sales messages rely heavily on emotional appeals, but most persuasive business messages rely more on logic than on emotion. And even if your audience emotions influence their decisions, they're still going to look for logical support. So a logical appeal uses 3 different types of reasoning. For your logical appeal, you can use an analogy, which basically is just borrowing from something familiar to explain something unfamiliar. You can use induction, where you work from specific evidence to a general conclusion, or deduction, where you work from generalization to a specific conclusion. For logical appeals that you use, make sure that you verify the rational argument that you're making carefully. You also want to guard against faulty logic. Faulty logic can include such things as making hasty generalizations or circular reasoning, or even making a very complex issue seem overly simplified. Remember that we're wanting to balance the emotion with the logic. And this figure can be found in your book on page 295. Whenever you plan a persuasive message, imagine that you have a knob that turns from emotion at one extreme to logic on the other, letting you adjust the relative portions of each type of appeal. Compare these 2 outlines for a proposal and then ask management to fund an on-site daycare center. That's the example that's being used for this figure. The version on the left relies heavily on emotional appeals, whereas the version on the right uses logical appeals. Through your choice of words, your images, and your details that you're providing, you can adjust the emotional and logical ratio in every message. Third strategy is reinforcing your position. So after you have worked out the basic elements of your argument, step back and look for ways to bolster the strength of the position that you're taking. Are all the claims that you're making supported by believable evidence? Next, look at your language. Could you use more powerful words to convey your message? As with any powerful tool, be sure to use vivid language. In addition to your individual word choices, consider using metaphors or other figures of speech. In a similar way, brief stories, which we talked about earlier in one of our online lectures, they can help your audience grasp the meaning and importance of your argument. And finally, look for factors that can reinforce your position. When you're asking for something, your audience members will find it easier to grant your request if they stand to benefit from it as well. And then finally, the fourth essential strategy is anticipating objectives. Even the most persuasive messages can expect to encounter some initial resistance. So anticipate as many of these objections as you can and try to address them in your initial message before your audience can even bring them up. And by doing that, you can remove the potentially negative elements from the conversation and keep the focus on positive communication. If you're expecting your audience to be hostile, meaning biased against your plan before they've even heard what you've had to say, make sure that you cover all options, exploring the cons and pros of every point. That'll give you additional credibility, and also people will have an easier time supporting what they've helped you create. So involve your audience in the design of the solution if you can. Finally, let's look briefly at how to avoid common mistakes in your persuasive communication. So when you believe in a concept or a project that you're proposing, it's really easy for you to get caught up in your own emotions and to forget to see things from your audience's perspective. So when putting together your persuasive arguments, some of the mistakes that you can avoid are things like using a hard sell. So don't push too hard. No one likes being pressured into making a decision. Be careful about making the mistake of resisting compromise. Sometimes we really own the ideas that we're presenting and we feel very passionate about exactly what we've proposed, but really persuasion should be a process of give and take. So a persuader rarely changes another person's behavior or viewpoint without altering his or her own viewpoints in the process. If you want me to be open to looking at compromise, then you need to be open to looking at compromise as well. Another common mistake is relying solely on great arguments. Great arguments matter, but they are only one part of this equation. Connecting with your audience on the right emotional level and communicating through vivid language are all just as important, and they bring life to your argument. And then the last common mistake that we'll mention is assuming persuasion is a one-shot effort. So sometimes persuasion is a process and not a one-time event. More often than not, persuasion involves listening to others and then testing a position, developing a new position, and then more testing, more compromise, and so on before you actually get to a final result. You also have to remember here that different people have different personality types, and some people gather information and make decisions quick, lickety-split. They've got the information, they're making the decision, they're moving on to the next thing, where other people have to take all of the information in and then they need time to process, to think about, to review, and then come up with what their thoughts are. And it's a slower process that can take hours to days. So make sure that you're remembering all of the different personality types and information processors that you have in your audience, and that you're remembering that this moment, this is not necessarily just the only moment that you're going to have to talk about the persuasion that you're trying to pitch. So throughout your business career, you're going to have lots of opportunities to write persuasive messages for your organization. You're also going to find many of the routine requests that we studied in Chapter 8 can become persuasive messages if you want a non-routine result or believe that you haven't received fair treatment. Most of these messages can be divided into persuasive requests for action, persuasive presentation of ideas, and then persuasive claims and requests for adjustment. So I'm sure you're beginning to see the repeat from Chapter 8 here. The first type of persuasive message is your request for action. This is actually going to account for the majority of the messages that you're going to be involved in writing. And in some of these cases, your requests are going to be anticipated and they're going to require minimal effort on the recipient's part, so the direct approach works just fine. In others, you'll need to introduce your intention indirectly. The second common category of persuasive message is the presentation of ideas. You may encounter situations in which you simply just want to change attitudes or beliefs about a particular topic without asking the audience to decide or to do anything. The goal of your first message might be nothing more than encouraging your audience to consider a new idea or to admit to the possibility of new ways of thinking. And then the third kind of common persuasive message is the persuasive message for claims and requests for adjustments. So most claims are routine messages and they're going to use the direct approach. However, customers and business professionals sometimes encounter situations in which they believe they haven't received a fair deal by following normal procedures. So these situations require a more persuasive message. The key ingredients of a good persuasive claim are a complete and specific review of the facts and a confident and positive tone based on your right to be satisfied with every transaction. You're the one that's writing the persuasive claim rather than the response to the claim, but you're the one writing the claim. Remember to keep a positive tone as you review the facts. Simply outline the problem and where you are with the problem and give the reasons that the company should grant your claim, and then finally, of course, always close on a respectful note. Learning objective number 3. Describe an effective strategy for developing marketing and sales messages and how to modify your approach when writing promotional messages for social media. So marketing and sales messages use pretty much the same techniques as other persuasive messages, with the added emphasis of encouraging someone to participate in a commercial transaction. So marketing messages usher potential buyers through the purchasing process without asking them to make an immediate decision, where a sales message will then take over and encourage them to actually make the purchase decision then and there. So as we are planning our marketing and sales messages, as always, we want to understand the needs of our audience. So depending on the product and on the market, these things can range from a few functional considerations to a complicated mix of logical and emotional issues. So marketing and sales messages are in competition with messages from other companies that are intended for the same audience. You're fighting for the same piece of the same pie. So finding a unique message in crowded markets can be challenging, but they can also be fun to come up with some of those thoughts. With insight into your audience needs and your competitive offerings, the next step is to decide which features and benefits you want to highlight. Those are your selling points, and those are your most attractive features about your idea or your product. And then the benefits are the particular advantages that the user will realize from those features. So selling points focus on what the product does, while benefits focus on what the user's experiences will be or what their gains will be. Marketing and sales messages often encounter objections, or surprise, surprise. As with persuasive business messages, it's best to identify them up front and try to address as many as you can. Of course, any attempts to minimize perceptions of price or other potential negatives must be done ethically. Remember that all things in regard to sales and marketing have high ethical standards, because these are governed by different bodies of and you can always end up in court if not. In writing most marketing and sales messages, you can use the AIDA plan that we talked about earlier, or some variation thereof. Remember, AIDA stands for attention, interest, desire, and action. So you can get your audience's attention by offering an exciting product benefit or interesting news or an appeal to people's emotions or sense of financial value. Marketers can also use images, music, animation, and video. So after catching your readers' or your viewers' attention, your next step is to build interest in the product or the idea you're promoting. So a common technique is to pay off the promise made in the headline that you've written by explaining how you can deliver those benefits that you've listed. Next, you want to look at increasing desire, and you can do that by looking at your audience's desire for the service that you're offering or the product that you're offering by expanding on how it will benefit them. So focus on their practical and as well as their emotional needs. Then explain how your product or service will meet those needs and address their potential objectives and doubts with demonstrations. You can even do testimonials or money-back guarantees. And then, of course, the final step in the AIDA model is persuading the audience to take action. So you want to motivate them to take action, such as placing an order by phone or online. The keys to a successful call to action are making it easy and risk-free as possible. So let's look at social media for just a second. Though the AIDA model has been successful with marketing and sales messages for really decades, in the social media landscape, consumers are more apt to look for product information from other consumers rather than from the companies that are marketing the products. So a few really quick points to just point out. Make sure that as you write promotional messages for social media, that you get involved in online conversations. So in social media, your emphasis is going to shift from encouraging and participating. It should shift from trying to get the sale to encouraging and to participating in online conversations. Those conversations need to look for ways to actually build community, a way for your customers and your audience to connect with each other and with your company. You need to listen as much as you talk. So listening is actually essential for online conversations, just like it is in one-to-one personal conversations. Make sure you're providing information that people actually want. And as always, be authentic, be transparent, and be real. Social media audiences respond poorly to fake blogs and superficial attempts to be social. Instead, they respond positively to companies that are open and conversational about themselves and about the product and any interest that you guys share. And quickly reviewing a couple of points, if you're creating promotional messages for mobile devices, and I know we've talked about this before, make sure that you keep your message short and simple. And remember that the screen is small and how you can navigate in the screen and whether or not your message is coming across in the way that the screen is set up and will display the information. And because we are usually, when we're on our phone, we're looking for quick, fast information, make sure that the mobile experience that you create is straightforward and fast. If it's not, mobile users are going to quickly abandon your website, and they don't normally return to websites that have been difficult for them to navigate. Finally, learning objective number 4, identify steps you can take to avoid ethical lapses in sales and marketing messages. So the word persuasion has negative connotations for some people, especially if you are using them in a marketing or sales context. Business people view persuasion as a positive force and align their own interests with what is best for their audience and give them the freedom to choose what they want. To maintain the highest standards of business ethics, make sure that you always demonstrate the you attitude by showing honest concern for the needs and the interests of your audience. And of course, make sure that you understand the basic legal aspects of promotional communication. The FTC has the authority to impose penalties against any advertisers who violate federal standards for truth in advertising. You need to be familiar with those and make sure that messages that you're creating do not violate those. And just building on that thought, make sure that your messages for your marketing and sales are truthful, that they're not deceptive, that your claims are supported by evidence that you can show if required, and that you don't ever do bait and switch advertising because that's illegal. A couple more thoughts on the legal aspects and ethics. Make sure that your marketing messages and websites aimed at children and minors are subject to special rules, that you're aware of those and that you've applied those. Make sure that your messages are truthful, because in many states they're actually binding contracts. And finally, remember to respect the rights of any individuals that you use in photographs or in name. In most cases, you can't use a person's name or their photograph or other forms of identity without permission, and you need to be especially careful of that in regard to children. So before launching a marketing or sales campaign, marketers must also be up to date on the latest regulations affecting spam and customer privacy and data security. And those right now are changing daily, so just make sure that you're working with your legal department to make sure you are up to date. Awesome. I hope you've enjoyed this chapter as much as I have. We are ready for a new section when we get together next time. We are going to start looking at preparing reports and presentations. I'll see you for Chapter 11.